Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Data Convos hosted by Stop AAPI Hate and Act to Change. Today, we bring you the urgency of the pressures and concerns we felt for the past year and beyond as two organizations focus on amplifying and uplifting the experience of our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. I'm Nancy Tan. I'm a board member with Act to Change, and we work to address bullying, especially in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. We leverage a comprehensive approach that spans programming, partnerships, digital outreach, and policy and advocacy to drive change. I'm joined today by Manju Kulkarni, Executive Director at Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, also known as APCON. She's representing Stop AAPI Hate, and I'll pass it off to Manju to share more.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all and to collaborate with Act to Change. This is such a great event and really so important for us in terms of talking about what's happening to our youth, how they're reacting, and really some of the recommendations that we can make to bring about change in our communities. So if we can, we'll start with our slides. And I wanted to just share with you some of the work that we've done at Stop AAPI Hate, and also to sort of share those experiences that our youth have had and what they've reported to us at the organization. So as soon as we can get those up, I will go through them. Let me start off by, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say thank you so much. We're so grateful to be partners with Stop AAPI Hate in this work. And to share more with everybody, we'll be sharing both of our reports, or two reports today. So Act to Change released our first Asian American Bullying Survey report May of this year in partnership with Next Shark and Admirasia. And in a second, we'll have Manju go into the Stop AAPI Hate recent report on incidents. And actually with that, I'll just give it back to you, Manju. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nancy. Apologies for starting early, but obviously this is a subject about which I'm very passionate. And so I wanted to, next slide, talk about, how we've come to understand hate against our communities and especially against our youth. So as early as February of 2020, we began to learn of incidents against youth in our communities. And you see here two of the stories, one where a group of youth went to the airport and were harassed by other teenagers and who made racist comments against them, connecting them to COVID-19. The second example is one that took place online, similarly blaming Asian American youth for COVID, referencing their, eating habits and connecting those back with the disease. So, really troubling incidents were happening to youth. Next slide. And then we also saw that they were happening against youth and adults in our communities. So you see the one example there of a middle school child here in Los Angeles who was physically attacked and verbally assaulted on the schoolyard. And he was accused of having COVID-19 and told to go back to China. And when he said he was not Chinese, essentially he was punched in the face and head 20 times. These type of examples obviously were very concerning. We began to work on them immediately at APCON, as did our partners in the Bay Area. And you'll see other examples indicating that surge of COVID-19 related racism, where a white male struck an individual, physically attacked him. There's another example of workplace discrimination. And then sadly too, the small example on the right is of elderly grandparents simply going on a walk with their child and grandchild and then being accosted just while they were in their neighborhood. So again, all troubling examples. Next slide. And so it was for this reason that my organization, APCON, began to collaborate with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University. And immediately upon launching on March 19th, we made sure that the form was available in multiple Asian languages that you see there. And we also conducted significant outreach. And being trusted community partners, we knew how important that outreach was, as well as that language access. Next slide. And so what we decided to do in terms of the work of Stop AAPI Hate is to serve as the nation's leading aggregator of anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate incidents. Up to this point, we've received over 9,000 hate incident reports from all across the country. We've also offered multilingual resources for impacted individuals. We've provided direct assistance from rapid response to preventable measures on not only our website, but by our staff members. We've also offered support in terms of community-based safety measures. And lastly, advocating with local, state, and national policymakers to reinforce human rights and civil rights protections. Next slide. And so last year, after we established the reporting center, we knew how important it was to begin to engage our youth. And so in the summer of 2020, we created the Stop AAPI Hate Youth Campaign. And that youth campaign was made up of over 100 young people from across the country. You'll remember during the early part and much of 2020, we actually were under stay-at-home orders. And so these youth participated online through Zoom sessions. And part of their campaign and their internship involved interviewing 990 young adults. So essentially 10 per person, and finding out what their experiences were and the feelings that they had. And so we found out essentially that about 8 out of 10 expressed anger over what was happening, and 6 out of 10 expressed disappointment over the racism, many times of which they had not experienced before. AAPI youth who had experienced racism firsthand were more likely to be concerned about their families, and they were also more likely to be saddened by those experiences, experiencing mental health impacts than the peers who hadn't. We know that the harassment that these young people faced often involved blaming China and Chinese people as the source of the virus and mocking Chinese and other Asian American dietary habits. And the AAPI youth that were surveyed, expressed their deep concerns about the hate, and that they believe very strongly that the racism was wrong, and that blaming one particular group, of course, in this case, our community, was incorrect, inappropriate, and of course, problematic. Next slide. Alongside that report done by the AAPI youth called "They Blame Me Because I'm Asian," we also, as adults, did a youth incident report where we looked at, after an 18-week period, the number of incidents that involved youth in our communities, and found at that time that there were 341 out of what was about 2,500 overall. And you'll see there the types of discrimination. Over 8 out of 10 said that they reported being bullied or verbally harassed. 1 out of 4 faced shunning and social isolation. And there were, in fact, even 24 physical assaults, or 8%, where individuals were physically attacked in one way or another. In terms of that discrimination, youth were more likely than adults, of course, to be harassed at schools, also public parks and online. Girls were 2.5 more times likely to report hate incidents than boys. And then in over half of the cases, perpetrators employed that anti-Chinese hate speech, which I mentioned before. And then finally, adults were present in almost half of the incidents, but did almost nothing to intervene, and only intervene in about 10% of the cases. So that's, of course, troubling, and really makes us think of what we would recommend in terms of next steps. Next slide. So I'll leave it there, and want to just say that, this is a program that we've continued. We had the youth campaign again in 2021, and we'll be releasing in October our findings from that campaign, and continue to monitor this and continue to work with amazing organizations like Act to Change. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Manju, and the team at Stop API Hate for the incredibly important report. As I was still teaching when the pandemic started, and I, as an Asian American educator, I kind of witnessed this increase and rise in anti-Asian sentiment. And knowing the history of America, I think it's so important at this time that we're taking the time to document and really report and share the experiences of our community. It may not be widely known, but for organizers and activists, as we call for those in power to find solutions for change, I think a critical missing piece in all the conversations is data and research on our own communities. And so it's so important that we're having these discussions. To share more insight from youth on bullying experiences, we have Act to Change's Managing Director, Belinda Lay, briefing us on the Act to Change 2021 Asian American Bullying Survey Report. Take it away, Belinda.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share a report with you today. The 2021 Asian American Bullying Survey Report is the first ever product of a partnership between Act to Change, Admirasia, and Next Shark in order to better understand how Asian American students are experiencing bullying, especially in light of the rise in AAPI hate crimes due to COVID-19. Through 11 short questions that cover demographics, identity, and bullying experiences distributed on NextShark's platform in fall 2020, this survey provides a snapshot of the Asian American bullying landscape. Next slide, please. So here are just some of the demographics that we received from the responses. 65% of our respondents identified as female. We had a wide range of ethnicities, including Chinese, Asian Indian, Filipino, Korean, Vietnamese, and Japanese. And almost half of our respondents fell into the 14 to 18 age range. Next slide. In terms of our key findings, the results from the survey were sobering, and we are grateful to over 300 people who responded to our survey sharing their experiences with bullying. We know that bullying is rampant among the survey respondents. Over 80% of Asian American respondents had experienced bullying due to various factors, from physical appearance, accent, cultural habits, financial status, and origin. Furthermore, cyberbullying surged in 2020. This is bullying that takes place digitally or through the phone, where many youth spend their time. Around 70% of respondents experience or witness more cyberbullying. Unfortunately, Asian Americans are less likely to report bullying to adults than non-Asian Americans. Non-Asians are about 1.5 times more likely to tell an adult about bullying compared to Asian Americans. 38% of Asian Americans told an adult about bullying, compared to 63% of non-Asian Americans. Some reasons that were cited are they didn't think it would change anything, they didn't want to worry others, they worried it would make things worse, there was shame about speaking out, and they didn't know it was racism. Not only that, adults, such as caregivers, parents, educators, they lack the skills, knowledge, and conviction to take action. About 1/3 of adults did not take action, according to our survey. We also heard painful quotes from respondents, bringing to life the pain from bullying. Next slide, please. Some of these quotes included things such as emasculation faced by Asian male youth is an invisible topic that needs more discussion. Trash was thrown at me in the school bus because I was Filipino. They discussed it once with the class and kind of swept it under the rug. I had to start going to counseling to get help because of the things I went through. These are just some of the incredibly powerful quotes and saddening quotes that we heard from our survey report. And we really aim to address some of these issues in our next section on key recommendations.
Thank you both, Belinda and Manju, for these insightful and necessary reports. I'm very curious to hear more about the learnings and impressions from the research that was done. And before we pass it back to both of you all for recommendations, we encourage all our viewers, either tuning in from YouTube or Facebook or another platform, to enter in your questions via the comments. They'll pop up for us here on our streaming platform. And while we get those in during the next part of the presentation, we'll then answer your questions afterwards during our Q&A section. So for now, I'll pass it back to Belinda and Manju to share key findings from their reports.
Thanks, Nancy. So based on our key survey findings presented today, the data suggests that bullying and racism directed at Asian American youth are normalized in our society. This normalization imposes a vicious impact on the development of self-confidence and mental health for Asian American youth by weakening their willingness to report the case or seek help from adults and educators. Meanwhile, many parents of Asian American youth and school educators are not necessarily equipped with the knowledge needed to address the bullying cases or provide improvement solutions. It is time to address the issue through collective efforts from different entities in society. We call for help from corporate brands, policymakers, and community organizations that have the right resources. And we truly believe that through awareness, resources, programs, data collection, and disaggregation, we can help put an end to bullying and racism. And on the slide that we see here, this is just an overview of several recommendations that we have in our bullying report. I highly recommend for folks on this call to check out the URL that is in the banner right now to look into more of our key findings and our recommendations and resources to take it a step further. I'll hand it over to you, Manju.
Thanks so much, Belinda. So in terms of our key recommendations, we had 5, and these came directly from the youth that participated in our youth campaign. So I want to state that very clearly because they know their experiences. They know about the hurt and trauma they've experienced. And, I just want to take a moment too to share that particular piece of it, which is that, when we looked at the 900 surveys that our youth did, as well as all of the incident reports, it's a reminder that what we're talking about is really trauma, suffering, and the fact that our youth are experiencing this at such young ages, I think really reminds us as adults that we need to take action, and we need to take that action as soon as possible. So here we have a number of short-term as well as long-term solutions for addressing the problem of hate and discrimination against our AAPI communities. So first off, the youth said resoundingly that they wanted to see ethnic studies curriculum throughout secondary schools. They wanted to be able to learn about their histories as well as the histories of different communities in the U.S., the roots and the impacts of racism, as well as the movements such as, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, AAPI movement, how they've sought justice. And I think, this has come up right now in the news, oftentimes in terms of the issues around critical race theory. And I think what we know is we actually do have ethnic studies currently, but what it is it's a study of a particular ethnicity, which is white communities. And so what students are calling for is to know and understand the history of all communities and not simply that of white Americans. The next bullet point is about providing anti-bullying training for teachers and administrators that include practices of social and emotional learning. This is such a critical component of dealing with the problem, because we know that too often teachers don't react appropriately. They don't take the right action, and they often don't even know what the protocols should be or what they are in their own schools. We saw this with a middle school child in Los Angeles, where local school administrators did not report it, and in fact made the situation worse by making derogatory comments about the child's parent, by really dismissing their concerns, and by providing trainings for teachers and administrators. We really hope to get at that so they can help students who have experienced the trauma, so that they can help parents and be able to address the parents and the family's needs, and so that all students in the classroom understand what has happened, and that there are steps taken to prevent this from happening again. The third bullet then is about training students as well as adults in restorative justice practices. So really trying to replace those zero tolerance approaches that we've known to be ineffective. And sadly, those zero tolerance practices, we know also contribute to the school to prison pipeline and really serve to further incarcerate Black and Brown youth. And so it's really important that we look at other solutions. Again, I will point to the incident in the LA middle school where, because the mother was a social worker, she was very keen on using such practices. She did get significant pressure from school police as well as LAPD to file a police report and to take criminal action essentially against the child. But she also knew that the perpetrator, the bully in this particular case, had himself some developmental delays. And so for that reason, as well as many others, she knew that it was not appropriate to bring criminal charges against him. So I think we need to really be able to take that as an example and use it throughout all of our schools. Next, it's really looking at how we help victims of online harassment, providing reporting centers. Obviously, we have Stop AAPI Hate, and I'd certainly encourage everyone who's experienced a hate incident to report to us. We keep all of your information confidential. We don't release identifying information without your explicit permission, but it helps us to understand the problem and then to work with collaborative partners like Act to Change, as well as policymakers to develop solutions. We also advocate for social media platforms to have processes in place when there is hate on their particular platforms. And then finally, when we look at what can be done long-term to support students, affinity groups came up for our young people again and again. They said they want to have groups that they feel comfortable in, especially for many of those students who may be the one of two or three Asian American or Pacific Islander students in their school, going to mostly schools with white children or with African American and Latinx children. So having a place where they have friends and classmates who are like them, who've had similar experiences. And to add to that, school safety and anti-racism campaigns within the school as well. to support students, make them feel welcome, make them feel that they have a place and that they belong in that school community. Next slide. And so in addition to those recommendations, we have recommendations for essentially everyone who is on this webinar. We want to encourage those who've experienced hate, as I said, to report to Stop AAPI Hate's website, to share resources and safety tips, the ones that we provided, but also other organizations have provided as well. There's so much great material provided by Act to Change, by Advancing Justice and other organizations. You can take a bystander training course by Advancing Justice and Hollaback and other entities. I know that several groups in LA are also providing bystander training. Advocate for community-based safety efforts in your local communities, in your cities, your counties. Advocate for knowing your history, ethnic studies programs at your schools, and contacting elected officials and advocating for increased resources. And what I'll add to that is also that at Stop AAPI Hate, we have a model resolution that we're encouraging every city and county in the country to pass, simply to condemn hate. And surprisingly, in 2021, that's controversial in some places. In fact, in different parts of the country where it's been tried, it's sadly failed because some communities just simply don't want to condemn hate. They, in fact, want to embrace it now. So it's important for us to know who our allies are within city government, who are those folks that we need to challenge, and really begin to take more substantive action. And then finally, working with workplace, school, and community organizations, not only for those type of statements, but even to move beyond that, to get programs in place that address our needs. So with that, I'll stop, and I think I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Great. Thank you so much for thank you both for the recommendations. And we did have a question come in. So our first question is, what was the most surprising thing that you all learned in conducting these reports?
Go ahead.
I think the most surprising thing was honestly the statistics. I knew that bullying was definitely something that had risen amongst AAPI youth, especially anecdotally. But once we had looked at the survey data and seen how bad and persistent bullying had become, where 80% of Asian American youth had experienced bullying, and on top of that, the fact that they felt like there was no adult support, where in the data we also saw 1/3 of adults not take any action when reporting was done. I felt like that was extremely disheartening, but also empowering in the sense of there's so much work to be done and we can do better as a community.
For me, what was surprising is, similar to Belinda, is seeing the data. And, really, I was so saddened and disheartened by the fact that this was happening to so many of our youth. And to read the stories, to read the hate incident reports that were either provided by youth or their parents, this is a widespread problem. But what I could also say is I was also surprised by how much these young people understood about the problem. They were able to really take a deep dive into Asian American history, make connections with what happened under the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese American incarceration, the killing of Vincent Chin, and so many other incidents in our history. They were also able to connect it directly to policies that were in place. So understanding that it wasn't simply interpersonal hate incidents, but it was in fact governmental policies that fed the hate and perpetuated it. And lastly, I was really surprised and so excited to see these young people take action. So the fact that they got together, they wrote this fantastic report, and if I could brag about them for a second, their report was even featured in Teen Vogue last fall. And so, they're becoming activated, I think is so important, not only for shaping their lives and improving their conditions, but for our movement as a whole, because they're going to be our future leaders. So really glad to see them take that action, become activated, and to show leadership.
I love that so much. And I with your example of the Teen Vogue feature, I feel like that is an example of adults who are really keeping in mind like how to be partners with youth in addressing bullying and hate. And I wanted to ask a follow-up question. So what do you both think is most important for adults who either work with kids or are family members to youth to keep in mind when being partners or allies? And I guess I'll pass it. Yeah, Belinda.
All good. The number one thing that comes into mind for me is honestly just awareness of the problem. Oftentimes I hear anecdotally about how adults tend to dismiss it, either due to cultural reasons or language barriers or just miscommunication in general. There's a lot of telltale signs when it comes to bullying, and sometimes that's just missed completely. And you might also, without being aware of it, perpetuate the idea of not speaking up yourself, either through messages that you might think are harmless, or something such as like, oh, be strong, just sweep under the rug. Those type of comments really manifest into something deeper over time. And also sharing the information resources that are out there with your kids as well. So through our bullying report, Act to Change also has a bullying fridge page, which is a helpful infographic of sorts that talks about what is bullying, what is physical bullying, cyberbullying, verbal bullying, defining what that is, and also what steps that can be taken in a very digestible way for students and parents to look at together and review, along with any resources to links and organizations that might help in terms of reporting a case or finding the mental health resources necessary to think about the impacts of bullying.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Belinda has said. And, too often we do see parents and adults either dismissing or minimizing the incidents. And, it's often just because of, how they grew up. Because, they were told, keep your head down, don't essentially make yourself known, don't stand out. So, we can't completely blame them. That was often the culture. But also there is an American culture that we have to remember as well, which is that model minority framing, which essentially silenced us in a lot of ways. So it wasn't simply our own Asian American or Pacific Islander culture that told us to be quiet. From the model minority framing, we were essentially told we were a model because we kept our mouth shut. We supposedly did well economically, though we know that Asian Americans are like every other community. We have struggles and challenges, and we have differences between individual communities in terms of income and assets. But, the second part of that framing by Professor Peterson in the 1960s was that Asian Americans were a model because we didn't speak out. And for him, problem minorities were African Americans who demanded civil rights, who demanded programs like the Great Society. Can you imagine that in the middle of the civil rights movement that he had the audacity to say that? And so I think for many folks in the older generations, they took that message to heart. And so really have tried to minimize even their own examples of suffering and trauma. I would also say that, understanding now our history and that particular framing, adults have an opportunity to speak out themselves and be an example for young people, so that when they experience something, show that vulnerability, show that, tell their kids, yes, this was really hurtful to me. And this is, these are the actions I took. I've been speaking out about it. I think that matters so much to young people, to see that their parents are also sometimes struggling and having these hardships. And being a parent of teens, I can tell you that those are some of the stories that resonate most with my own children, is knowing that their parents also have gone through some challenges. And the last thing I would say is, being civically engaged, right? I think what we're seeing from our young people through their participation in surveys, in these programs, is they do want to be engaged in their communities. And in fact, we did a survey of all of our respondents and found that one of the main reasons for reporting to Stop AAPI Hate was because they wanted to see changes in their communities and in our country. They wanted to be more civically engaged. So they didn't necessarily seek it out for direct help or assistance, but they wanted to be part of that broader movement. And so I think it's so important. I can tell you, here in California, we have an election today. And it was important for me and my husband to take our two daughters who are able to vote. And we've done that since they were essentially toddlers. And every time they get a sticker that says, I voted, when we were voting. So to just create that culture of participation and engagement, I think, is so important. Often parents tell their kids that they want them to do well financially, they want them to do well in school, but they don't say anything about that civic engagement piece. And we know that all of those are important. We're not going to do well as a community unless we also have the ability to be active citizens in our democracy.
Thank you both for that response. Part of your response, Manju, about the bottom minority myth kind of surrounds and answers like a thought process in even the need for this data, because when you even when you disaggregate data, that's super important and really illuminates some misconceptions about Asian American Pacific Islander communities. We had another question come in the chat, and this question says, for those of us that don't interact as much with teens, can you recommend resources for volunteering time that is like mentoring or money that can help teens that experience bullying? And I guess I'll pass it to Manju first.
Well, I was actually going to point to the Act to Change materials. You all have so many great resources, especially directed at youth, and some of the programming, that you've done with Tan France and others. And I'll let Belinda talk about those. But I think there are a lot of great resources out there. In addition to what you all have produced, there is a website called Embrace Race, which is helping not only parents, but also teachers, educators know how to talk to young people about race, about some of these struggles, whether it's African-American youth and law enforcement, it's our youth in some of these hate incidents. I think, looking to these programs, I understand there's even a project of a coloring book, for really young children of Asian American and Pacific Islander leaders. If I can, I'll add it to the chat, but these are things that are out there, and really want to appreciate what you all have done in terms of making those available directly to our community members.
Yeah, I think everything that Manju just mentioned is fantastic. Of course, like Act to Change, we work directly with youth. But when I think about the mentorship angle, there are so many different organizations out there, both locally and nationally, that you can work with to engage with teenagers. So for instance, one organization that I worked with directly in Boston is called Minds Matter, and they have a couple of different they work in a couple of different cities, and you actually have a teenage mentee who is looking for better educational attainment. And when it comes to other mentorship opportunities that maybe you might not be able to directly engage with a nonprofit org, I know a lot of companies also have ERGs that also give employees opportunities to volunteer with the local community. And if you notice that the ERG does not have those opportunities, maybe it's time for a conversation with the ERG to help expand on those opportunities. I also do think from a donation perspective, there are a lot of AAPI organizations, including Stop AAPI Hate, Act to Change, and Hate is a Virus, which we also collaborate with. But there is a long list out there. It's really about getting the conversation started on what can I do today and acting on it. And I think that makes all the difference.
Belinda, I think you have responded with the perfect segue into the final question: is what future collaborations or events or programming will Stop API Hate or Act to Change have in the future that our audience members can participate in or look forward to? And I'll pass it back to Belinda.
Yeah, so I actually alluded to this already, but we have a youth summit coming up next month. We have an annual youth summit actually for October, which is also Bullying Awareness Month. And it is in collaboration with Stop AAPI Hate and Hate is a Virus. And there is more information to follow, so please definitely follow Act to Change, Stop AAPI Hate on our social networks. And there will be tickets going out soon, but I am incredibly excited for the full day of planning and programming ahead. The team has been working incredibly hard to make sure that all the programming is fantastic and the youth are deeply engaged with all of the different topics we'll be presenting.
Manju, what about Stop API Hate?
Well, we are participating in that summit, and I'm so excited about it because it really is, about so much of what we've talked about today, which is activating the youth, giving them the resources, the training, so they can go out and do this work in their schools, in their communities. And I would say for us at Stop AAPI Hate, we have a few things coming up. One is we will be releasing our newest youth report next month as well. So folks can look out for that. And, our youth campaign is something we're going to continue. We had the second year of the program this past summer. And in fact, some of the youth have continued in that internship into the fall. And so in the spring, I'd encourage parents, teachers, and youth themselves to look out for that information so that young people can apply. We've been able to use the Zoom type features in a way that really enables young people from all across the country to participate. We know that, democracy is not a spectator sport. And so we've, just as with a soccer team or volleyball, we've got to train our young people early, get their democracy muscles primed and ready to go so that when they can vote, that they do, and that they, consider running for office, that they get involved in policy work, that they take leadership in their offices, through their ERGs, et cetera. So these kind of programs, I really can't say enough about how important they are, and really want to encourage everyone to attend the summit next month.
Thank you both so much, Manju and Belinda. I can't express more gratitude on how important it is to be amplifying the experience of our youth. I think back to myself as a youth, and I wish, some of these reports existed, and I wonder what it would have done for myself and my self-esteem. I wanted to extend a special thank you to both the Stop API Hate and Act to Change team that made the programming and reports possible and who are working behind the scenes today. Thank you to all our viewers, both youth and adults that tuned in. We did get a final comment, and I wanted to touch on it, that events like this, awareness and education really is the key. Sharing that we have a united front against racism, against hate. That is truly the path to change. We see all of you, we hear you, and we hope to see you join the action for change. We do have a post-event survey. Please take our post-event survey. And you can also find the links to both of our reports on the Data Convos registration page through Act to Change or our respective organization websites. Recapping one more time that you can stay in touch with us. Find us on social media. Stop AAPI Hate is available or has presence on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. There is an upcoming report that will be released soon. Act to Change, we have a presence on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. And our upcoming youth conference is on October 16th. We will be launching a request for proposals for workshops. So if you're interested in being a presenter at our youth summit, look forward to seeing more information on submitting a proposal. Or if you're interested in attending as a youth or an adult, we'll be posting information on how to register soon. And again, on behalf of everybody, I appreciate you all. Thank you again for attending and tuning in, and we hope that you stay safe and take care. Thanks, everyone.